Some disappearances are violent, some are mysterious, but this one was impossible. On the evening of March 14, 1967, a lighthouse keeper named Arthur Brennan stood at his post on the edge of the world, watching the Atlantic Ocean crash against the rocks below. He was alone, as he had been for weeks, in a tower that rose 200 feet above the black water. The lighthouse at Cape Mercy, Nova Scotia, was his domain, his prison, his purpose. And on that night he recorded the weather in his logbook with the same careful precision he had shown every night for 11 years. Wind speed, 23 knots. Visibility, moderate. Sea state, rough. Temperature, 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The light turned. The fog pressed against the windows. And somewhere in the hours that followed, Arthur Brennan ceased to exist. But here's what makes this story different from every other disappearance you've heard. When relief personnel arrived 3 days later, they found the lighthouse functioning perfectly. The light was turning on schedule. The logbook was meticulously updated through that very morning, March 17th. The last entry, written in Arthur's unmistakable hand, read, "Dawn clear, wind subsiding, all well." And yet Arthur was gone. His coat hung by the door. His breakfast sat half-eaten on the table, the oatmeal still warm to the touch. The coffee in his mug had not yet grown cold. Most disturbing of all, the lighthouse door was locked from the inside, the heavy iron bolt thrown into place. The only other exit led to a narrow platform that jutted out over a 200-foot drop onto jagged rocks, where the ocean waited like an open mouth. No body was ever found. No evidence of struggle, no note, no explanation. Arthur Brennan had vanished from a locked room at the top of a tower surrounded by sea, leaving behind a life that appeared to still be in motion, as if he had simply stepped out of his own existence mid-breath. This is the story of the impossible disappearance at Cape Mercy. This is the story of a man who couldn't have left, and yet did. This is a file that has remained open for nearly 60 years, not because we lack evidence, but because the evidence we have makes no sense at all. If mysteries like this pull at something deep inside you, if you find yourself drawn to the questions that have no answers, then subscribe to this channel. Because the files I open here are the ones that refuse to close, and this one, I promise you, will stay with you long after the light goes out. Let me take you back to the beginning. Let me tell you about Arthur Brennan. He was born in 1922 in a fishing village so small it doesn't appear on most maps anymore. A collection of weathered houses clinging to the coast of Nova Scotia, like barnacles to a hull. His father was a fisherman who drowned when Arthur was 7. His mother raised him and his 2 sisters in a house that smelled of salt and lamp oil, where the wind rattled the windows every night, and the sea was both provider and threat. Arthur grew up understanding isolation. He grew up understanding that the ocean takes more than it gives. And perhaps that's why, when he was 21 years old and the war had just ended, he applied for the position of assistant lighthouse keeper at Cape Mercy. He wanted solitude. He wanted purpose. He wanted a life measured in the turning of a light, the recording of weather, the maintenance of a beam that kept ships from the rocks. Cape Mercy Lighthouse was built in 1873 on a narrow promontory that jutted into the Atlantic like an accusing finger. It was a tall white tower with a red cap, elegant in its simplicity, brutal in its isolation. The nearest town was 12 miles away along a dirt road that became impassable in winter. The lighthouse keeper lived alone for months at a time, supplied by boat when weather permitted, by nothing when it didn't. It was a posting for men who preferred the company of wind and water to the company of other humans. It was a posting for men like Arthur Brennan. He started as an assistant in 1943, working under an older keeper named Thomas Whitmore, learning the rhythms of the light, the maintenance schedules, the careful recording of weather and ships and anything unusual observed from that high vantage point. Whitmore described Arthur as quiet, reliable, almost obsessively precise. "The boy treats the logbook like scripture," Whitmore wrote in a letter to the lighthouse service. "Every entry is perfect, every task completed before I can ask for it. If there's such a thing as being too conscientious, Arthur has found it." In 1949, when Whitmore retired, Arthur Brennan became the head keeper. He was 27 years old. He would hold the position for the next 18 years. Those who knew him described a man of few words and many habits. He woke at dawn, regardless of how little sleep he'd had. He maintained the light with religious devotion, polishing the lens until it gleamed, checking the mechanisms, ensuring that the beam swept the horizon every 10 seconds with metronomic precision. He kept the logbook with an almost artistic attention to detail, his handwriting small and neat, his observations thorough. Wind direction, speed, temperature, barometric pressure, visibility, sea state, ships sighted, their direction and approximate tonnage, any unusual weather phenomena, any equipment issues, any thoughts worth recording. The logbook wasn't just a record, it was Arthur's conversation with the world. He read voraciously. The lighthouse had a small library of books left by previous keepers, and Arthur supplemented it with orders from the mainland. Philosophy, history, poetry, astronomy. He taught himself celestial navigation, not because he needed it, but because he wanted to understand the stars he saw every night from his tower. He learned to identify birds by their calls, ships by their silhouettes. He became, in his isolation, a scholar of the particular, an expert in the specific geography of wind and wave that surrounded his tower. But he wasn't a hermit by temperament. Every 6 weeks, when the supply boat came, Arthur would go into town for a few days. He had a small room he rented above a tavern. He had friends, or at least friendly acquaintances, men he'd drink with at the bar, talking about weather and fishing and the small dramas of village life. There was a woman, Margaret Hastings, a schoolteacher, who by all accounts had captured Arthur's attention. They'd been seen together several times in the months before his disappearance, walking along the harbour, sitting together at church. Margaret later told investigators that Arthur had mentioned marriage, had talked about perhaps taking a posting at a less isolated lighthouse, somewhere she could visit, somewhere they could build a life. He wasn't unhappy, she insisted, tears in her eyes. He was making plans. He was looking forward. This matters. This matters because the easiest explanation for what happened at Cape Mercy is the one that the official investigation eventually settled on. Suicide. A man alone in a tower, isolated for months, finally succumbs to despair and throws himself into the sea. It's tidy. It's tragic. It's happened before at lighthouses around the world. Isolation can break the strongest mind. Solitude can become a kind of madness. But this explanation requires us to ignore everything we know about Arthur Brennan in the days and weeks before he vanished. Let me tell you about those final weeks. Arthur had returned to the lighthouse on February 23rd, 1967, after a week on the mainland. It was meant to be a long stint, 8 weeks alone before the next scheduled relief. The weather that winter had been brutal, and the supply boat had already missed one scheduled run because of storms. Arthur went back well stocked, carrying extra provisions, extra lamp oil, extra everything. He'd said goodbye to Margaret at the dock. A witness, a fisherman named Robert Keane, later testified that Arthur had kissed her, something he'd never done in public before. He seemed happy, Keane said. Like a man with something to look forward to. The lighthouse records show that Arthur maintained his usual routine through February and into March. Every day, every entry, precise and complete. The weather was often harsh. Several nor'easters swept through, bringing high winds and heavy seas. Arthur recorded it all. On March 3rd, he noted damage to the railing on the exterior platform, which he repaired the following day. On March 7th, he observed a pod of whales passing offshore, heading north. 20 or more likely humpbacks travelling together. A good omen, the old-timers would say. That was the closest Arthur ever came to poetry in his official records, that single line about omens. The last routine radio contact with the lighthouse was on March 10th. The keeper of another lighthouse, 30 miles down the coast, had a scheduled check-in with Arthur at 10 in the morning. They spoke for 3 minutes. Arthur reported all systems normal, weather improving, no issues to report. The other keeper, a man named Donald Pierce, said Arthur sounded perfectly normal, maybe even in good spirits. They discussed the weather forecast, agreed that spring seemed to finally be arriving, and signed off. It was an utterly unremarkable conversation. It was the last time anyone heard Arthur Brennan's voice. March 11th, 12th and 13th passed with no scheduled contact. This was normal. Keepers were only required to report in every few days unless there was an emergency. But the lighthouse light was visible from several points along the coast, And it continued to turn every night, a faithful beacon Arthur's purpose made visible. March 14th was clear and cold. We know this because Arthur recorded it. Wind from the northwest at 18 knots, visibility excellent, sea state moderate. He noted 2 fishing vessels passing to the south in the afternoon. He recorded the sunset time, 6:21. And then, in the evening log, he made an entry that has become the subject of endless analysis and debate. Strange sound at dusk, like metal grinding, but from no visible source, persisted for approximately 20 minutes, then ceased. Checked all equipment, all functioning normally. Sound did not return, worth noting. That's all. No elaboration, no theory, just an observation, recorded with Arthur's usual precision. Strange sound, metal grinding, no source, and then it stopped. After that, nothing unusual appears in the log. March 15th and 16th show routine entries, weather observations, the light maintained, all normal. And then March 17th, the final entry. Dawn clear, wind subsiding, all well, all well. The relief keeper, a young man named Peter Dalhousie, arrived at Cape Mercy on the afternoon of March 17th. He'd been delayed by rough seas, but was finally able to make the crossing. He approached the lighthouse by boat, circling to the small dock that had been blasted out of the rocks decades earlier. The light had been visible the night before, turning on schedule. Everything appeared normal. The lighthouse stood white and solid against the blue sky, the beam housing gleaming in the afternoon sun. Peter tied up the boat and climbed the steep stairs cut into the rock face, carrying supplies, looking forward to seeing Arthur, to sharing whatever news had accumulated over the past weeks. The exterior door at the base of the lighthouse was locked. This was standard procedure. Peter knocked and called out. No response. He knocked again, louder. "Arthur, it's Peter. I've got your supplies." Nothing. Peter felt the first tickle of unease. He tried the door. Locked solid. The lighthouse had 2 keys, one kept by the current keeper, one held by the lighthouse service supervisor on the mainland. Peter had neither. He called out again, his voice echoing off the rocks. The wind caught his words and scattered them. The sea churned below. Peter circled the tower, looking for any sign of Arthur. The lighthouse had small windows spiraling up its height, but they were thick glass, impossible to see through clearly from outside. Peter cupped his hands around his eyes and tried to peer into the lowest window. He could see the interior stairway, shadows and stone. Nothing moving. He completed his circle and returned to the door. The unease was growing now, becoming something sharper. Where was Arthur? The lighthouse was functioning. The light had turned the night before. Arthur had to be inside. Peter made a decision. He returned to the boat and retrieved a heavy wrench, then climbed back to the door. He spent 20 minutes battering at the lock, finally breaking it, finally forcing the door open. The metal shrieked as it gave way. Peter pushed inside, breathing hard, calling Arthur's name. The base of the lighthouse was a round room, stone walls, a few pieces of furniture. Arthur's coat hung on a hook by the door. His boots sat neatly beneath it. The room was tidy, as it always was with Arthur. Nothing appeared disturbed. Peter crossed to the spiral staircase that wound up the interior of the tower and began to climb, still calling out, "Arthur, Arthur, are you here? Are you all right?" His voice bounced off the stone, multiplying, surrounding him. No answer came back. The living quarters were on the second level, about 30 feet up. Peter emerged into the keeper's room, a circular space with a small bed, a desk, shelves of books, a cast-iron stove, a table and chair. And here Peter stopped. Here the unease became something close to fear. The table was set with breakfast, a bowl of oatmeal, a spoon resting in it, a mug of coffee, a plate with 2 slices of bread. The food was there, present, waiting. Peter approached slowly and reached out to touch the bowl. It was warm. Not hot, but warm. The oatmeal had been cooked recently, within the last hour, maybe less. The coffee in the mug was lukewarm. Peter picked it up, his hands shaking slightly. He could smell it, bitter and strong, the way Arthur always made it. "Arthur." His voice was quieter now, uncertain. "Arthur, this isn't funny." He searched the room. The bed was made with military precision, corners tight, blanket smooth. Arthur's personal effects were arranged neatly on the shelves. Books, a pocket watch, a framed photograph of Margaret, letters tied with string. The desk held the logbook, closed, a pen resting on top of it. Everything was in its place. Everything was normal, except Arthur wasn't there. Peter climbed higher into the lamp room where the great lens resided. Where the light that saved ships was housed, the mechanisms were all functioning. The lens gleamed. The lamp oil reservoir was 3/4 full. The clockwork system that rotated the lens was ticking steadily, a sound like a massive pocket watch. Peter checked everything with hands that felt numb, all normal, all perfect, all as it should be. He climbed the final ladder to the exterior platform, the narrow walkway that circled the lamp housing. The door to the outside was closed but not locked. Peter pushed it open and stepped out into the wind. The platform was perhaps 4 feet wide, surrounded by a waist-high iron railing. It offered a panoramic view of the ocean, endless and grey-blue, stretching to the horizon in all directions. Below 200 feet down, the rocks waited, black and jagged, waves breaking white against them. Peter gripped the railing and looked down. Nothing. No body on the rocks. No disturbance in the water. Nothing. He circled the platform slowly, examining everything. The railing was solid. The platform itself showed no signs of struggle, no marks, no damage beyond the usual wear of weather. Peter noticed that the section of railing Arthur had noted repairing on March 4th was indeed newly bolted, the metal bright against the older, weathered iron. Arthur had done the work. Arthur had been here. But Arthur was gone. Peter stood on that high platform for a long time, the wind pulling at his clothes, his mind trying to make sense of what he was seeing, or rather, what he wasn't seeing. Finally, he went back inside, climbed down to the living quarters, and did the only thing he could think to do. He opened the logbook. The entries marched down the pages in Arthur's careful hand. Dates, times, observations. Peter flipped to the most recent pages. March 14th, March 15th, March 16th, March 17th. That final entry, dawn clear, wind subsiding, all well. Peter checked his watch. It was now 3:15 in the afternoon. Dawn had been roughly 12 hours ago. The entry was fresh. Arthur had written it this morning. Peter looked at the bowl of oatmeal, still warm on the table. He looked at the coffee, still drinkable. He looked around the room at the coat hanging downstairs, at the boots by the door, at every detail that suggested a man who had stepped away for a moment and would return any second. But Peter knew, with a cold certainty that settled in his stomach like a stone, that Arthur Brennan was not coming back. He radioed the mainland. The lighthouse service supervisor, a man named Harold Moss, took the call. Peter explained the situation, his voice tight, trying to stay calm, trying to stay rational. Moss listened, asked questions, then told Peter to secure the lighthouse and wait. Help was coming. It took 6 hours for the authorities to arrive. The local constable, Thomas Wright, made the crossing with Harold Moss as the sun was setting. By the time they reached the lighthouse, Peter had searched every inch of the tower 3 times. He had found nothing new. Arthur's coat, his boots, his warm breakfast, his completed logbook entry. And Arthur nowhere. Wright and Moss conducted their own search by lamplight, going over everything Peter had already examined. Wright was a practical man, middle-aged, a veteran of the war, not easily shaken, but even he felt the wrongness of the scene. "It's like he was pulled out of the world mid-breakfast," Wright said later, like someone reached down and plucked him away. They examined the door at the base. The lock that Peter had broken showed no signs of having been forced from the inside. The bolt on the interior had been thrown. Arthur had locked himself in, standard procedure for a keeper alone. The only other way out was the platform door, and that led only to a 200-foot drop. Wright and Moss went up to the platform in the fading light, studying the rocks below with binoculars. Nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign of impact. The tide was low, exposing more of the rocks than usual. If Arthur had fallen, if Arthur had jumped, there should have been something. But there was nothing. They spent the night in the lighthouse, the 3 of them, keeping watch as if Arthur might reappear as mysteriously as he'd vanished. Peter slept in fits, waking at every sound, hoping to hear footsteps on the stairs. Wright dozed in a chair, his constable's training keeping him half alert. Moss, who had known Arthur for years, sat at the desk and read through the logbook, page after page, looking for any clue, any hint of what had happened. He found none. Just weather, ships, maintenance, and that one strange entry about a sound like grinding metal. At dawn, they radioed for more help. A full search was organized. Over the next 3 days, teams combed the coastline for miles in either direction, examining every beach, every cove, every place a body might have washed up. Divers went into the water around the lighthouse rocks, searching the depths despite the dangerous currents. A boat circled the area repeatedly, crew members scanning the water for any sign. They found nothing. Not a piece of clothing, not a personal effect, not a single trace of Arthur Brennan. The investigation that followed was thorough, frustratingly so for those who wanted answers. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police took over, sending investigators who treated the lighthouse like a crime scene. They photographed everything, measured everything, took samples of everything. They interviewed everyone who had known Arthur, building a profile of his final weeks and months. They examined his financial records, his correspondence, his medical history. They were looking for a motive, a reason, an explanation that would make sense of the impossible. What they found was a man with no reason to vanish. Arthur's finances were in good order. He had savings, a modest amount, but enough to indicate responsible management. He had no debts, no enemies, no legal troubles. His correspondence with Margaret showed a man in love making plans, looking forward to a future. His medical record showed good health, no indication of mental illness, no history of depression or instability. His friends and acquaintances all described him the same way: quiet, reliable, content in his isolation, but not damaged by it. The investigators found no suicide note, no indication of despair, no evidence that Arthur had been planning to end his life. They focused, inevitably, on that final strange entry in the logbook. Strange sound at dusk, like metal grinding, but from no visible source. What did it mean? The investigators brought in a mechanical engineer to examine every piece of equipment in the lighthouse. The lens rotation mechanism, the lamp, the foghorn, the ventilation systems, the door hinges, everything that might produce a grinding metal sound. All were functioning normally, with no signs of recent malfunction or unusual wear. The engineer concluded that if there had been a mechanical issue, it had resolved itself or was so minor as to leave no trace. But Arthur had heard something that lasted 20 minutes, something worth recording. The investigators theorized that perhaps a ship had passed close by, some mechanical issue on the vessel producing the sound. But Arthur had specifically noted, from no visible source. And Arthur knew ships. Arthur would have recognized a ship sound and logged it as such. This was something else, something that bothered him enough to note but not enough to elaborate on. Just an observation filed away in his meticulous record. The physical evidence of the lighthouse itself became the focus of intense analysis. The locked door, the warm breakfast, the completed logbook entry. The investigators tried to construct a timeline. Arthur had made his dawn entry in the logbook at some point after sunrise, roughly 6:30 in the morning. He had then prepared breakfast, cooking oatmeal, making coffee, setting the table. This would have taken perhaps 15 minutes, so Arthur was still in the lighthouse, still alive, still functioning normally at approximately 6:45 on the morning of March 17th. Peter had arrived at 3:15 in the afternoon. That left roughly 8.5 hours unaccounted for, 8.5 hours during which Arthur had vanished, leaving his breakfast warm. The investigators consulted with medical examiners about the warmth of the food. How long would oatmeal remain warm in a room with a cast-iron stove? How long would coffee stay drinkable? The answers were imprecise, variables of room temperature, air circulation, initial heat of the food. But the consensus was that for the food to still be warm when Peter arrived, Arthur couldn't have been gone for more than an hour or two, 3 at the absolute maximum, which meant Arthur had been present in the lighthouse until sometime between noon and 2 o'clock on March 17th. But that raised more questions than it answered. Why would Arthur prepare breakfast at dawn and then not eat it for 6 or 7 hours? Why would he let it sit? The investigators looked for evidence that Arthur had been interrupted while preparing the meal, called away by some emergency. But the lighthouse showed no signs of emergency, no equipment failures, no ships in distress, nothing that would have pulled Arthur away from his breakfast urgently. And if he had been interrupted, why not return? Why not eat? Why let the food sit and then vanish? Unless the breakfast had been prepared later, unless Arthur hadn't made it at dawn at all, but rather in the early afternoon, shortly before Peter's arrival. But that contradicted the logbook entry, which was clearly a dawn observation. Unless Arthur had made the entry, then gone back to sleep or busied himself with other tasks, then prepared breakfast hours later. But that didn't fit Arthur's known routines. He always ate after making his dawn entries. Always. For 11 years, that had been his pattern. The investigators circled the problem again and again, trying to find a logical sequence of events that explained the evidence. They couldn't. Every scenario had holes, every timeline had gaps. The facts were clear, the facts were impossible. The theory that gained the most official support was this. Arthur had made his dawn entry, prepared his breakfast, and then, seized by a sudden impulse or mental break, had gone up to the exterior platform and thrown himself into the sea. The locked door could be explained by the fact that Arthur had locked it himself before going up, standard procedure. The warm food was simply a matter of timing. Peter had arrived sooner after the event than the food temperature suggested. The lack of a body was unfortunate, but not unheard of in these waters. The currents around Cape Mercy were treacherous, strong enough to pull a body far out to sea within hours. Divers had searched, but the ocean is vast and bodies don't always surface. Suicide. It was clean. It closed the case. On August 3, 1967, Arthur Brennan was officially declared dead, presumed to have taken his own life. The file was closed. The lighthouse was staffed with a new keeper. Life moved on, as it always does, around the edges of tragedy. But there were problems with this conclusion, problems that bothered people then and continue to bother people now. If stories like this haunt you, if you find yourself drawn to the questions that authorities leave unanswered, then subscribe. Because what I'm about to tell you next doesn't fit the official narrative. And once you hear it, you'll understand why this case refuses to stay closed. First problem, Arthur's coat and boots. If he had gone up to the platform intending to jump, why not wear his coat? It was March in Nova Scotia. The platform was exposed to wind that would cut through clothing. Arthur was practical, methodical. If he was going outside for any reason, he wore his coat, but it hung on the hook, untouched. The boots sat by the door. Arthur had been in the lighthouse in his indoor clothes, and he had never changed to go outside. The investigators argued that this proved the impulse was sudden, unplanned. But Arthur was alone. If he had made the decision to end his life, even suddenly, wouldn't he have taken the 30 seconds to put on his coat? Wouldn't basic comfort, basic instinct, have driven him to dress for the weather? Second problem, the platform door. It was closed when Peter found it. Not locked, but closed. If Arthur had gone out to jump, the door would have been open or at least ajar. A man walking through a door to his death doesn't carefully close it behind him. The investigators suggested that the wind had blown it shut. Possible. But on March 17th, according to Arthur's own log entry, the wind was subsiding, moderate at best. Would it have been strong enough to pull a heavy door shut against its hinges? Third problem, the lack of a note. Suicide notes are common, but not universal, so this alone isn't conclusive. But Arthur was a man who wrote everything down. His logbook was his constant companion, his way of processing the world. If he had been spiraling towards suicide, there should have been some indication in those pages. A change in tone, a darkening of observations, something. But there was nothing. Just weather and ships and routine, all the way to the end. All well. Those were his final written words. All well. Fourth problem. Margaret. Arthur had plans. He had spoken about marriage, about a different posting, about building a life. Margaret insisted, tearfully, repeatedly, that Arthur had been happy in their last conversation. The investigator assigned to interview her noted in his report that she was credible and deeply bereaved, showing no signs of deception or withheld information. If Arthur was suicidal, he hid it completely from the woman he loved, showed no warning signs, gave no indication. Possible, yes. People hide their pain. But combined with everything else, it strained belief. Fifth problem, and perhaps the most troubling, the timing. For the suicide theory to work, Arthur had to have jumped sometime after noon on March 17th to account for the warm food. But lighthouse keepers don't just abandon their post. The light has to be maintained, the lamp has to be checked. There are routines, schedules, responsibilities. Arthur was meticulous about these duties. If he was going to kill himself, why do it in the middle of the day, leaving the lighthouse unattended? Why not wait until evening, after the day's tasks were complete, after the light was properly set for the night? It seems like a small thing, but it matters. It matters because it's out of character, and everything about this case hinges on character. These problems, these inconsistencies, they bothered people. They bothered Margaret Hastings, who refused to believe that Arthur had killed himself and spent the rest of her life, she died in 2003, insisting that something else had happened. They bothered Peter Dalhousie, the young keeper who found the lighthouse empty, who never quite shook the feeling that he had arrived just moments too late to see something impossible. They bothered investigators, some of whom in retirement admitted that the case had never sat right with them. And they bothered the people who lived along that coast, who knew the lighthouse, who knew Arthur, who knew the ocean and its ways. Stories began to circulate, theories, speculation. The official explanation was suicide, but the unofficial explanations were far stranger. Some said Arthur had been taken by the sea itself, pulled from the lighthouse by forces beyond understanding. There were old stories about Cape Mercy, legends from before the lighthouse was even built. The Mi'kmaq people who had inhabited this coast for thousands of years had a name for the promontory. They called it Where the Waters Speak. There were stories of people vanishing near the cape, of strange sounds in the fog, of shapes seen in the water that weren't whales or seals. Sailors had long considered the waters around Cape Mercy to be unlucky, more prone to accidents and disappearances than geography alone could explain. When Arthur vanished, these old stories resurfaced, whispered in taverns and repeated in fishing boats. Maybe the sea had finally claimed its keeper. Others pointed to that strange entry in the logbook, the grinding metal sound. What if it wasn't mechanical? What if it was something else? In the years after Arthur's disappearance, there were reports never confirmed of similar sounds heard near the lighthouse. A fishing boat captain claimed to have heard it in 1971, a grinding, scraping noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A hiker along the coast reported it in 1984. The descriptions were always vague, always unsettling, like metal on metal, like machinery, like something wrong. Some theorized that there were caves beneath the lighthouse, chambers filled with water and air where the sea might produce strange acoustics. But geological surveys found nothing unusual. The rock was solid. There were no hidden caves, no acoustic anomalies. The sound, whatever it was, remained unexplained. And then there were the darker theories, that Arthur had been murdered, that someone had come to the lighthouse, killed him, disposed of the body, and locked the door from the inside before escaping somehow. But how? There was no boat at the lighthouse except the one Peter had arrived in. No helicopter had been seen or heard. The only approach was by sea, and the waters around the lighthouse were visible for miles. Someone would have seen something. And what motive would anyone have to murder a lighthouse keeper? Arthur had no enemies, no dangerous secrets, nothing worth killing for. The murder theory required too many impossibilities. Some suggested Arthur had faked his own death, that he had somehow escaped the lighthouse and started a new life elsewhere. But again, how? The locked door, the isolation, the lack of any evidence of planning. And why? Arthur had a life he was happy with, a woman he loved, plans for the future. He had no reason to run. And where would he run to? His face was in newspapers across the region after his disappearance. Someone would have recognized him, but no one ever came forward. No sightings, no leads, nothing. If Arthur was alive somewhere, he had vanished more completely than should be possible in the modern world. The theories grew more elaborate as the years passed, fed by the frustration of having no answer. Secret government experiments, alien abduction, time slips, parallel dimensions, the usual catalogue of explanations people reach for when the normal ones fail. Most of these can be dismissed as the product of overactive imaginations, and too many late-night radio shows. But they speak to something important, the human need for explanation. We can't accept that sometimes there is no answer. We can't accept that sometimes reality itself seems to break down, leaving us with evidence that contradicts itself, with facts that make no sense. In 1992, a researcher named Elizabeth Chen decided to take another look at the case. Chen was a forensic psychologist who specialized in unusual disappearances, and the Arthur Brennan case had fascinated her since she'd first read about it in graduate school. She obtained permission to access the original investigation files, which had been archived and largely forgotten. She spent months going through every document, every photograph, every interview transcript, and she found something the original investigators had missed, or at least hadn't given sufficient weight to. In the days after Arthur's disappearance, the lighthouse logbook had been examined carefully, but only the most recent entries had been analyzed in detail. The investigators had looked at the days and weeks leading up to March 17th, searching for signs of mental disturbance or unusual events. But Chen looked further back. She read through years of entries, tracking patterns, looking for anything anomalous. And she found 3 other entries spread across Arthur's 11 years at the lighthouse, where he had noted strange sounds. October 1955. Evening, approximately 8 p.m. Heard sound like distant bells, though no ships visible. Persisted for 10 minutes. June 1961. Pre-dawn. Sound like whispers or wind through cracks, but all windows secure. Ceased after approximately 15 minutes. January 1966. Afternoon. Sound like scratching on stone, seemingly from within the walls. Investigated thoroughly. No source found. Duration 30 minutes. 3 entries years apart, each describing something Arthur heard but couldn't explain. Each time, he investigated, found nothing, and noted it dutifully in the log. And then, March 1967, grinding metal. 4 times in 11 years that Arthur had heard something strange enough to record. Chen wondered if these events were connected. She wondered if the lighthouse itself might have some acoustic property that occasionally produced these sounds, some combination of wind and structure and rock that created auditory illusions. She consulted with acoustic engineers who said it was possible but couldn't offer any definitive explanation without examining the site. But here's what made Chen's research compelling. She tracked down the logbooks from previous keepers at Cape Mercy, going back decades, and she found that Arthur wasn't the only one who had noted strange sounds. Thomas Whitmore, Arthur's predecessor, had recorded similar phenomena twice during his tenure. The keeper before Whitmore had mentioned it once. Going back to the early 1900s, Chen found scattered references in various keepers' logs to unexplained sounds at the lighthouse. Not frequent, not regular, but persistent across decades, across different keepers, different men who had no knowledge of each other's entries. The lighthouse hears things, Chen wrote in her published paper on the case. Whether these are genuine acoustic phenomena, auditory hallucinations brought on by isolation, or something else entirely, they represent a consistent feature of Cape Mercy across generations. Arthur Brennan's final recorded anomaly fits a pattern. What it doesn't do is explain where he went. Chen's research didn't solve the mystery, but it added a layer of depth to it. It suggested that whatever happened to Arthur might have been connected to something inherent in the lighthouse or its location, something that had been present for decades. But that still didn't explain the locked door, the warm breakfast, the complete absence of any trace of Arthur's body. In 2008, Cape Mercy Lighthouse was decommissioned. Advances in GPS and automated navigation systems had made the lighthouse obsolete. The light was extinguished for the final time on a foggy evening in November, and the tower was locked up, left to the weather and the slow decay of abandonment. There was some talk of turning it into a museum or tourist attraction, but the remoteness of the location made it impractical. Cape Mercy Lighthouse became a monument to a vanished era, standing empty on its promontory, keeping watch over nothing. But before it was closed, the final keeper, a woman named Sarah Chen, no relation to the researcher Elizabeth, spent 3 months alone in the tower. She was interviewed by a local newspaper upon her departure, and she said something that sent a chill through everyone who remembered Arthur Brennan's story. I heard it too, she said. That sound, like metal grinding. It happened twice while I was there. Once in January, once in March. Both times at dusk, just like the old logs described. It lasted maybe 20 minutes each time. I checked everything, every piece of equipment, just like I'm sure all the others did. Nothing was wrong. But the sound was real. It wasn't my imagination. And I'll tell you something else, it scared me. There was something wrong about it, something that made me want to leave the lighthouse, to get away. I didn't. I stayed at my post. But I understood, standing there listening to that sound, how a person could just walk away. How they could want to escape it so badly that they'd do something irrational. The interviewer asked her if she thought that's what happened to Arthur Brennan. Sarah Chen paused before answering. I don't know, she finally said, but I know I won't miss that place. There's something there, something off. Maybe it's just the isolation, the way your mind plays tricks on you when you're alone too long, or maybe it's something else. Either way, I'm glad it's being shut down. That interview circulated online in the years that followed, becoming part of the mythology of Cape Mercy. People who are drawn to unsolved mysteries, people like you, people like me. We found it compelling, because here was a modern witness, a rational person with no stake in the legend, confirming that there was indeed something strange about the lighthouse. Not proof of anything supernatural, but proof that the phenomenon was real, that it wasn't just Arthur's imagination or the product of old superstitions. Urban explorers began visiting the abandoned lighthouse, breaking in, spending nights there looking for the sound, looking for answers, looking for the thrill of standing in a place where someone had vanished impossibly. Most found nothing but an empty tower and their own amplified fears, but a few claimed to have heard it. The grinding metal sound, sourceless and unsettling. These accounts are impossible to verify. Their stories posted on forums, videos uploaded to obscure channels, second-hand tales, but they persist. In 2015, a documentary crew got permission to spend a week at Cape Mercy, filming for a series about unsolved disappearances. They brought sound equipment, cameras, historians, a psychologist and a physicist. They interviewed locals who remembered Arthur. They explored the lighthouse thoroughly, documenting every room, every detail. And on the fourth night of filming, they recorded something. The audio file was analyzed by experts and included in the documentary. It's approximately 18 minutes long, captured by microphones placed in the lamp room. The sound is exactly as described, like metal grinding against metal, but with a strange quality that's hard to define. Some who've listened to it describe it as seeming to come from multiple directions at once. Others say it sounds distant and close simultaneously. The physicist on the documentary team admitted he couldn't identify the source or explain the acoustic properties. It's consistent with metal-on-metal friction, he said, but where it's coming from I have no idea. There's nothing in that lighthouse that should produce this sound. The documentary was respectful, measured, careful not to sensationalize. But it ended with no conclusions, only questions. What is the sound? Why does it occur? And most importantly, what happened to Arthur Brennan? The filmmakers walked away from Cape Mercy with more mystery than they'd arrived with, which is often the way with places that refuse to give up their secrets. I've listened to that audio recording dozens of times. You can find it online if you search hard enough. And every time I hear it, I try to imagine what it would have been like for Arthur, alone in his tower, hearing that sound for 20 minutes, unable to identify its source. Did it frighten him? Intrigue him? Did he lie awake that night thinking about it? And when he woke on March 17th, made his dawn entry, prepared his breakfast, was he still thinking about the sound? Did it have anything to do with what happened next? I don't know. No one knows. And that's what makes this case extraordinary. Let me tell you what I think, and I want to be clear that this is speculation, nothing more. A theory built on fragments and feelings, not facts. But I've spent years with this case, reading everything, listening to everything, trying to understand, and I've come to a conclusion that I can't prove but can't shake. I don't think Arthur Brennan killed himself. Nothing about his character, his circumstances, or his final entries supports it. The man who wrote All Well was not a man in despair. I don't think he was murdered. There's no evidence, no motive, no opportunity. The logistics make it nearly impossible. I don't think he faked his death. There's no reason, no planning, no sightings in nearly 60 years. So what's left? What explanation fits the facts, as impossible as they seem? I think Arthur Brennan left that lighthouse somehow. I think something happened on the morning of March 17th that compelled him to leave, quickly, without his coat, without finishing his breakfast. Maybe he saw something. Maybe he heard something. Maybe the grinding metal sound returned and this time showed him its source. I think he went outside onto that platform, and something happened there. Something that resulted in him going over the railing or through it or past it, into the sea or somewhere else entirely. Something that was urgent enough that he didn't take the time to dress for the weather. Something that was compelling enough that it overrode all his caution, all his training, all his survival instinct. And I think the door closed behind him, whether by wind or by his own hand or by something else. And I think his breakfast stayed warm just a little longer than physics says it should have, because the universe sometimes doesn't follow the rules we've written for it. And I think his body was taken by the ocean, or by something in the ocean, or by something that isn't the ocean at all, but looks like it from a distance. And I think the truth of what happened in those final minutes is something that would challenge our understanding of reality, if we knew it. That's what I think. And I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like the kind of speculation that leads to theories about aliens and time portals and all the rest, but I'm not proposing anything supernatural. I'm proposing something unknown. There's a difference. The ocean is vast and strange. The human mind is vast and strange. Reality itself may be stranger than we give it credit for. Arthur Brennan encountered something on March 17, 1967, something that the evidence suggests but doesn't explain. And that something took him away from his warm breakfast, his careful logbook, his life that was all well. In 2023, Margaret Hastings' granddaughter, a woman named Claire, published a memoir about her grandmother's life. Claire had grown up hearing stories about Arthur, about the man her grandmother had almost married, the man who had vanished from the lighthouse. Margaret had never remarried, had carried Arthur's memory with her for 36 years until her own death. Claire wrote about visiting Cape Mercy as a child with her grandmother, standing on the rocks below the lighthouse, watching Margaret stare up at the tower with an expression Claire couldn't read. She told me once, Claire wrote, that she didn't believe Arthur was dead, not in the conventional sense. She said something had happened to him, something we don't have words for. She said the ocean keeps secrets, and sometimes those secrets are people. I asked her what she meant, but she just shook her head. "You'll understand when you're older," she said. I'm older now. I still don't understand, but I believe she was right. Arthur didn't die that day, he just stopped being here. That line has stayed with me. He just stopped being here. It's poetic, vague, ultimately unsatisfying in its lack of concrete meaning, but it captures something essential about this case. Arthur Brennan didn't die in a way we can point to. He didn't leave in a way we can trace. He simply ceased to exist in our reality, as completely as if he'd been erased. The lighthouse stood, the logbook remained, the breakfast cooled slowly on the table. But Arthur was gone, leaving behind only questions and a sound like grinding metal that no one can explain. Cape Mercy Lighthouse still stands today, though it's deteriorating. The Canadian government has no plans to maintain it, and eventually the ocean will claim it, pulling it down into the rocks and waves, erasing the last physical connection to Arthur's story. Perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps the lighthouse has been holding on to the mystery for long enough and deserves to rest. But the story won't rest. Stories like this never do. They circulate, evolve, find new audiences. Someone listening to this right now is hearing about Arthur Brennan for the first time. Someone else has heard it before and is revisiting it, looking for details they might have missed. Someone else is planning a trip to Cape Mercy, wanting to stand where Arthur stood, to see what Arthur saw, to hear what Arthur heard. That's the power of an unsolved mystery. It invites participation. It invites you to think, to theorize, to wonder. So let me ask you, because I've told you everything I know, everything that's been documented, everything that's been speculated, what do you think happened to Arthur Brennan? Do you believe the official explanation, that he took his own life in a moment of impulse and the ocean took his body? Do you believe something more sinister occurred, some crime we can't reconstruct? Do you believe in the strange sounds, the acoustic anomalies, the idea that Cape Mercy is a place where reality occasionally stutters? Do you believe Arthur is still out there somewhere, alive, hidden, living under a new name in some distant place? Or do you believe, as Margaret did, that Arthur simply stopped being here, that he encountered something on that March morning that removed him from the world in a way we don't have the framework to understand? There's no wrong answer, because there is no answer, only the facts. The locked door, the warm breakfast, the completed logbook, the careful words, all well, and then nothing. Silence, absence. A man gone without a trace from a locked room at the top of a tower, leaving behind a life that looked like it was just beginning. I've spent years with this case and I still can't let it go. I still find myself thinking about Arthur at odd moments, wondering what his final thoughts were, whether he knew what was happening to him, whether he was afraid or at peace or simply confused. I think about him preparing that breakfast, cooking the oatmeal with the same care he applied to everything, pouring the coffee, setting the table. I think about him making that final entry in the logbook, his hand steady, his words calm. Dawn clear. Wind subsiding. All well. And then whatever happened next happened so quickly or so completely that he couldn't even cry out, couldn't leave a final message, couldn't do anything but vanish. There's a photograph of Arthur that Margaret kept by her bed until she died. Claire included it in her memoir. It shows Arthur standing in front of the lighthouse, probably taken by a supply boat crew member, probably from 1960 or 61. He's wearing his keeper's uniform, hands in his pockets, a slight smile on his face. He looks young, healthy, content. He looks like a man who has found his place in the world, who understands his purpose. Behind him, the lighthouse rises white and solid against a clear sky. And if you look closely at the photograph, if you really study it, you can see the ocean in the background, vast and dark, stretching to the horizon. You can almost feel the wind in the image, almost hear the waves against the rocks. It's a good photograph. It captures something essential about Arthur and his life at Cape Mercy. But it also reminds me of how small we are, how precarious our presence is, how easily we can slip from existence, leaving behind only photographs and questions and people who remember us. Arthur Brennan was real. He lived, he worked, he loved. He kept a light burning for ships that needed guidance. And then, on a March morning in 1967, he stopped being here, and no one knows why. That's the mystery, that's the tragedy, that's the story that refuses to end. If this case has affected you the way it's affected me, if you find yourself thinking about Arthur, about that lighthouse, about the nature of disappearance itself, then I invite you to subscribe to this channel, because there are other files like this one, other stories that resist explanation, other people who vanished or died in ways that challenge our understanding. I open these files not to sensationalize, not to exploit, but to remember, to honor the lives that were lived and lost, to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, to accept that sometimes the mystery is all we have. The Midnight File isn't about solving cases. It's about bearing witness to them. It's about acknowledging that there are corners of human experience that remain dark, no matter how much light we shine on them. And it's about finding meaning in the questions themselves, even when answers refuse to come. Arthur Brennan kept a light burning for 11 years. He guided ships away from the rocks. He fulfilled his purpose with dedication and precision, and then he was gone. The light kept turning for a while after him, maintained by other keepers, other hands. But eventually it was extinguished, and the tower was left to darkness. Maybe that's the real ending of this story. Not the disappearance itself, but the slow fading of the light that followed. The world moving on as it always does around the absence of one man. But we don't have to forget. We don't have to move on. We can keep Arthur's light burning in a different way by remembering his story, by refusing to accept easy explanations, by insisting that his life and his disappearance matter. Every time someone hears this story, Arthur exists again, if only in our minds. Every time someone asks what happened at Cape Mercy, the lighthouse stands again, white and solid, with Arthur inside, making his dawn entry, preparing his breakfast, living his final morning. All well, he wrote, all well. And then he was gone. I don't know if Arthur Brennan is at peace, wherever he is, whatever happened to him. I don't know if consciousness survives death or disappearance, or the strange transitions that take us from one state to another. But I hope he found something on the other side of his vanishing. I hope the grinding metal sound, if it was the last thing he heard, led him somewhere instead of nowhere. I hope his final moments, whatever they were, weren't filled with fear, but with understanding, with a sense of completion that we, left behind with our questions, can't access. That's all we can do with mysteries like this. Hope, wonder, remember, and carry the story forward, passing it to others who will carry it in turn, a chain of witnesses spanning decades, connecting the past to the present, to the future. Arthur Brennan vanished in 1967, but he's still here, in every telling of his story, in every question we ask about his fate. He's still the keeper, still maintaining the light, still guiding us towards something, even if we don't know what. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the mystery itself is the answer. Maybe the point of Arthur's story isn't to solve it, but to experience it, to let it change us, to allow it to remind us that the world is stranger and deeper than we pretend it is in our daily lives. We walk around assuming we understand reality, assuming the ground beneath our feet is solid, assuming that locked doors stay locked and warm breakfasts mean someone was just here. But sometimes the ground shifts. Sometimes doors open to places that shouldn't exist. Sometimes people vanish, leaving behind only evidence that contradicts itself and questions that multiply instead of resolve. Arthur Brennan walked into one of those places, or something from one of those places came for him, or he discovered that the lighthouse, the ocean, the world itself is not quite what we think it is, and he stepped through, or fell through, or was pulled through into whatever comes next. And we're left standing in his room, looking at his breakfast, reading his final words, trying to understand. All well. The lighthouse at Cape Mercy is empty now. The light is dark. The ocean still crashes against the rocks below, indifferent, eternal, keeping its secrets. Someday the tower will fall. Someday even the rocks will erode. Someday there will be nothing left to mark the place where Arthur Brennan kept his vigil, and then vanished. But the story will remain. Stories outlast stone. Questions outlast answers. Mystery outlasts certainty. This is the Midnight File. This is the story of Arthur Brennan, the lighthouse keeper who couldn't have left but did, who couldn't have vanished but is gone. This is the story of a locked door, a warm breakfast, a completed logbook, and a sound like grinding metal that no one can explain. This is the story of one man's disappearance and our 60-year attempt to understand it. And this is my promise to you. I will never stop opening files like this. I will never stop asking questions that have no answers. I will never stop bearing witness to the strange, the impossible, the unexplained. Because someone has to remember, someone has to care, someone has to keep the light burning, even if only the metaphorical light of attention, of curiosity, of refusal to forget. If you feel the same way, if you're drawn to these dark corners of human experience, if you want to stand with me at the edge of understanding and peer into what lies beyond, then subscribe. Share this story with someone who appreciates mystery. Leave a comment telling me what you think happened to Arthur. Join the conversation that has been ongoing for nearly 60 years. Become part of the chain of witnesses, because the next file I open may be darker still. The next disappearance may be stranger. The next mystery may be closer to you than you think. The world is full of locked doors and warm breakfasts and people who stop being here without explanation. And every one of them deserves to be remembered. Every one of them deserves someone asking why. Arthur Brennan stood at the edge of the world on March 17, 1967, and something happened. Something that defies our understanding, that challenges our assumptions, that reminds us that for all our knowledge and technology and certainty, there are still things we don't know. Still places we can't reach, still questions we can't answer. He kept the light burning for 11 years. Now we keep his story burning. It's the least we can do. It's all we can do. And maybe, somewhere in the dark, in whatever place Arthur found himself that morning, maybe he knows. Maybe he understands what happened in a way we never will. Maybe he's at peace with the mystery that torments us. Or maybe he's trying to send us a message, trying to explain. But the distance is too great, or the language is wrong, or we're simply not listening in the right way. I'd like to think that if we listen carefully enough, if we pay attention to the grinding metal sounds and the locked doors and the warm breakfasts of the world, we might hear something. A whisper, a hint, a clue that would finally, after all these years, tell us what happened to Arthur Brennan. But until that day comes, if it ever does, we have this: the story, the mystery, the question that refuses to be answered. We have a lighthouse standing empty on a promontory called Cape Mercy, where the waters speak and people vanish and nothing is quite as solid as it seems. We have Arthur's final words, written in careful handwriting in a logbook that's now preserved in an archive somewhere, gathering dust, waiting for someone to open it again and read those last lines. Dawn clear, wind subsiding. All well, all well. But it wasn't. All wasn't well. All hasn't been well since that morning when Arthur prepared a breakfast he never ate and vanished from a locked room at the top of a tower, leaving behind only his absence and our questions, and a case that will never close, not really, not until we understand what it means to simply stop being here. This has been The Midnight File. I'm Julian Cross, and somewhere tonight, in some corner of the world, someone is about to vanish in a way that makes no sense. Someone is about to encounter the impossible. Someone is about to become a mystery. And when they do, when their story joins the others in the files I keep, I'll be here, listening, remembering, bearing witness, because that's all we can do for the ones who slip through the cracks in reality. We can remember them. We can tell their stories. We can refuse to let them fade into complete silence. Arthur Brennan, lighthouse keeper, lover, meticulous recorder of weather and ships and strange sounds. Arthur Brennan, who kept the light burning at Cape Mercy until March 17, 1967. Arthur Brennan, who vanished impossibly and completely, leaving behind only questions. This is his story, this is his file, and it remains and will always remain open. Until next time, when I open another file and we journey together into another darkness, I leave you with this. Look around you. Notice the locked doors. Notice the warm breakfasts. Notice the sounds you can't explain. Because the world is stranger than we admit, and the line between being here and not being here is thinner than we'd like to believe. Arthur Brennan crossed that line. And someday, in some way, we all will too. Good night. Stay curious. And remember, some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be carried with us. Reminders that, for all our certainty, we still live in a world of profound and beautiful unknowing. The light at Cape Mercy is dark, but the story burns on, and that, in the end, may be the only light that matters.